a great conference. Yeah. Lots of information. It was
A lot, obviously, that you knew, but put together in an interesting way, and I thought the discussion was really interesting. Had I thought about it, I should have brought the final report just to have out there.
You can do that yourself. I'll do it. You good? Yep.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here. It's a great pleasure for us to be able to host this terrific event today in conjunction with the Canada Institute, and I've got David Biet, the director of the Canada Institute, to my right here. Energy has become an increasing focus of our work at the Wilson Center in general, and is of particular importance for the Mexico and Canada Institutes, particularly as we adopt more of a North American approach to a lot of our work, from borders, competitiveness, investment, and energy. A couple of weeks ago, many of you will have been here for a terrific event that we had with organized by Jan Kalitsky, talking about the outlook for North American energy. And we're trying to build that momentum and keep a series of events going, looking at North American energy challenges in the weeks and months ahead. Last week, of course, in conjunction with the Atlantic Council, the Mexico Institute was delighted to present Undersecretary Lourdes Melgar from Mexico and the head of the Mexican electricity utility, the CFE, Enrique Ochoa Reza, who presented their perspectives on the Mexican energy reform. And of course, in today's program, as you will have seen, we've got an amazing lineup where we've got energy experts and representatives of government, both past and present, who are going to be talking. Later on today, we're going to be having former Energy Minister Jordi Herrera from Mexico, and then to close out our panels today, we'll have the current Undersecretary of Electricity, Cesar Hernandez, talking about Mexico, along with a lot of other perspectives from both the United States and from Canada. Mexico's game-changing reform, of course, is just one of the elements that we're observing in the changing North American energy landscape. I'm sure David is going to talk a little bit about the vote yesterday, which so many of us will have been closely observing. And of course, we're looking ahead as well to December 15th, when the energy ministers of North America come together for the first time and trying to get a handle on what their agenda might look like. We've got some clues already. It's clear that regulation and questions of human capital in the energy sector will be important there. Today's focus of our event is to really drill down a little bit on questions of infrastructure and the energy sector in North America, and to try to find out, where there is a lack of infrastructure, where we need to double down in terms of efforts of cross-border transmission, cross-border pipelines, etc., and to get a perspective from all three of the North American countries on these issues. Thank you so much for being here, for braving the cold outside. I look forward to a very lively discussion today, and with that, I'll pass it over to David Biet.
Thanks, Duncan, and welcome to the Wilson Center. I don't have too much more to add to what Duncan said. This is about infrastructure today, but it's not going to be a morning on the Keystone XL pipeline. I think we've had enough of that. I'm sure it will be referenced. There's lots in the news today, and it's certainly not gone away, so stick around for weeks, months, and there'll certainly be more on that. But one thing I wanted to say is that we can have all the energy in the world, and you can have it here, but if there's no way to get it to an end user, it doesn't mean much of anything. And that's what we're talking about today. The Canada Institute was something we did 2 months ago, I think, was looking at the politics and process of Keystone, which not necessarily was about that, but sort of what do we need to do in the United States politically and in a process-wise to get the infrastructure that we need, to get the different kinds of energy that we have, that we've been blessed with, to end users. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Andy Finn. Andy is a program associate with the Canada Institute. Really been up on top on a lot of the energy issues, and here we go. Take it away, Andy.
Thank you, David. Morning, everyone. Thank you for braving the cold, as everyone said. Just quickly introduce our panel, and then we'll get started. Seated to my left is Rachel Bronson. She's the Senior Fellow for Global Energy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and one of the foremost experts in global energy in the country. Seated to her left is the Honorable Rob Merrifield, who is Alberta's senior representative to the United States. Rob has been with us for about a month now in D.C. We're thrilled to have him here. And then seated to Rob's left is Antonio Rojas, who is the former comptroller of the Ministry of Energy, the Energy Regulatory Commission, the National Hydrocarbons Commission, and the National Commission for Energy Efficiency. Welcome our panel, and I think we're going to start off with Rachel now. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and I was asked to set the stage for the conversation. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this on? Great. We held an event in Chicago just a month ago on the future of U.S.-Canada energy relations, and I thought that it would actually be useful to talk a little bit about that conference in light of the North American energy landscape and what happens as we move from a bilateral discussion to a trilateral discussion or to a continental strategy. One of the key takeaways for that, and there were 5 key takeaways, was that North America, as we all know, is fast becoming the epicenter of a global transformation, revolution, renaissance in energy. It's one of the most important areas. My background had long been Middle East politics, and that's all about the geopolitics of energy. It's very interesting to think about what changes globally happen as that the focus of energy shifts back to North America. How do we think about it? How do we move forward? Is there possible ways for us to move forward in an integrated fashion rather than in 3 separate directions? So one of the key takeaways was just focusing on the massive transformations that are happening in the 3 states in North America. And it's worth just reminding ourselves of how fast this is changing. The key date to remember for the United States is really 2008, when all of this energy really began coming online, and that it's only 6 years ago. So if you look at where we were in 2008, where we were producing about 5.5 million barrels a day, we're at 8.5 now. That's a massive increase of almost 70%. If you look at our exports versus our imports, then we were importing about 60%. Now we're of our oil. Now we are at 33%. So for our energy needs, a massive transformation for the United States. Canada, very similarly. Canada, with its oil sands coming online and really beginning to push out, it's having a dramatic effect in its exports that Robert Merrifield will talk about. But even a recent report by CAP in Canada showed that if we stretch out our expectations to 2030, we're going to see another doubling of Canada's exports. And of course, we know in Mexico, the story is slightly different. It's about staunching the decline, if you will. The decline from what was about 4 million barrels a day to now in the mid-2s, and how to reverse that back up to reach the peaks of where it had been. So the transformation in the amounts of energy, obviously big in the global sector, is how that's affecting prices, but to remember how much of it's happening here. And that doesn't even account for all the deep water and all that's coming down in the future that I'm sure Antonio will begin to talk about. So a massive transformation. The conversation in Chicago, after focusing on how important the transformation of the energy landscape was, then turns to an issue of diversification. The markets are dramatically changing. So if you look at how the IEA, the International Energy Agency, talks about energy, it used to be a story about the developing world receiving, or the OECD country, all of the energy. But now, of course, the markets have in some ways the whole future of demand is in non-OECD countries, developing economies, with a considerable focus on Asia. So we're all beginning to think about how do we begin to fuel those markets. And an interesting conversation to think about, and it's a future issue, but one that we should keep in the back of our heads, is something that the Globe and Mail called, will we face a future of fuel friction? So it's all well and good to talk about how exciting this is and we should all be working together. But should we also be identifying areas where we might have some troubles because we're going to be competing for similar markets? And that's a future issue, but it's one down the road, one to take, and especially if demand doesn't grow as fast as we expect it to, which we know, of course, in the last year it hasn't. So what will that mean for the future? I think the issue for this conference is the third takeaway, which was a focus on transmission. How difficult is it, as David said, to move energy around? And here I think it actually is important to talk about Keystone. Not because, in terms of vote counting and how many votes and what's going to happen in January, but because it symbolizes one very, very important thing. It is extremely hard to build infrastructure. It's extremely hard to build infrastructure in the United States. It is extremely hard to build infrastructure in Canada, in Mexico, in the rest of the world. So if you go to Europe, that's what the conversation is. They can't build infrastructure. It's not just a U.S. issue. It's a hugely difficult issue for every country. And what's very important in the United States with Keystone is that it's been about a 6-year process. That's pretty average for building big infrastructure projects. So while this has gotten a considerable amount of attention, it's not unique. And before I came down today, I reread, probably one of the few who has reread the civil engineers infrastructure report. But when there's this quintessential report card that that is put out every year about the state of U.S. infrastructure. And I think the grade that they gave this year isn't different from any others. It was a D+. It is incredibly difficult to both get the investment and to move it. And on energy infrastructure, I think their grade was similarly a D+. There's money out there, and this recent election actually was very good for infrastructure. Many of the candidates who were running on increased investment, and they won. But especially when it comes to energy, it's not only the money getting allocated to it, because there is money there from the private sector, but there's huge public pushback. Nobody wants the transmission lines in their backyard. Even energy executives from Exelon, Koch brothers, they don't want it, and they're on record of signing petitions not putting it into their backyard. So if you think about how difficult, and this is why it's really important to talk about Keystone, because whether or not Keystone goes through, and there's a good chance that it will come January, whenever, this is the challenge that we're going to face. And so we see it in the United States. We certainly see it in Canada, where they're having big battles about where to put new pipelines and how to get their energy, whether east and west, and maybe you'll talk about Energy East and why that's a change. But this is a very big problem. So when we think about Mexico and all of the infrastructure that's going to be required to move all this newfound energy, it's something we have to take very seriously. So the Financial Times yesterday repeated the number that the amount of infrastructure needed to be built in Mexico is about 50% of what's currently there. So the billions, of almost $8 billion of investment is needed. But how hard that's going to be, not just getting the money, which is probably there, but actually moving it through the whole continent. The fourth issue we focused on is public trust, and that figures very prominently in this discussion. The public doesn't trust energy companies. They don't trust the energy companies, and they don't trust the governments to be responsible with it. And so in Canada, there was a very important report that put out that looked at how the populations think about the different sectors. And when it came to energy, the energy sector received very, very little approval or trust. And I think that's indicative not just in Canada, but across the whole continent. And so we need to rethink about how we build the conversation around energy. One of the takeaways from our conferences was not to rely on the federal governments to get this right, and therefore public confidence will be built. That this is really has to be done at a local level with companies, and the companies are learning how to do that.
Right.
So the fifth takeaway that we had after those four was that Mexico is a game changer, which is a perfect place for me to end where this conference is starting. That as we talked about the U.S.-Canada relationship, everybody realized that what was going on in Mexico was profoundly transformative, not only to Mexico, but to the continent itself. And Duncan was there and kind of laid out the beginning of that conversation. But what was apparent to us, and Duncan highlighted it, was, as always, these are still very much bilateral conversations. And that you can talk about U.S.-Mexico relations and U.S.-Canada relationships, and maybe there's a little bit going on in Canada-Mexico relations. But to think about what a continental strategy should be and would look like is essential for us to leverage the benefits of what we see coming. So with those 5 key takeaways, maybe that's a way to kick us off, and I'll turn it back to Andrew.
Terrific. Thank you, Rachel. Antonio?
Yeah. Actually, Rachel got to the point where she's saying that it is very much needed in Mexico an energy infrastructure. We have a lack of infrastructure because Pemex didn't have any money to invest in new infrastructure. So it's very much needed right now in Mexico. So the energy North America region could work, could be able to work. You told us right now that we needed anything between 50% of new energy infrastructure. I think that could be on the conservative side. I think we could need much more than that. Why? Because we just had we're just right now working on the new pipelines. You know, Ramones, that is coming down from the U.S. to Mexico with gas. But we need the shorter pipelines in order to get to the production centers in Mexico, no? And to the south, we need also gas at the south in Mexico. So that's a very important thing. And you got it right. I think it is a very big issue how to manage to get those pipelines done, no? Because I was thinking as you were speaking, the enormous amount of work that is needed in order to get the permits for the pipelines in Mexico. No, we have right now some trouble in Mexico with the eolic, the wind parks that we have in Oaxaca. We have some problems there because of some community problems that they don't want the wind power plants. No, so it's going to be a big issue to construct those short pipelines we need to get done. And I think also that money is there. Money is not, I think money is not a really big issue, but it is to get construction done. No? We don't have, also I think a big problem we have in Mexico is that we don't have the human resources. And then when I'm talking about human resources, it's about engineering that is needed to get those pipelines done. Not only pipelines, we need ports and pipelines and all kinds of infrastructure, no? Storage capacity, no? And we don't have the engineers to do that. I think that is going to be something that we have to work on in the future. And surely that's where international help is going to be needed, no? Also, Duncan asked me to talk about what would the energy reform would bring as an impact to Mexico, no? And as you should know, some public and private institutions right now estimate that Mexico long-term GDP will increase between 1 and 1.5% as a result of the reform. I think too that those figures could be conservative. Some people are talking about even 2% in the long term. No, so it's a very big thing for us, the reform in Mexico. And I think for the President Peña administration is the last shot of getting a real economy thriving in the future for Mexico. No, I think this is the big opportunity to have that. Also, it's been talked that the reform would create by 2025 more or less like 2.5 million new jobs. Not only 2.5 million jobs, some are saying that even 5 million jobs could be created by 2025. So it's also a very big issue here in Mexico to get the reform implemented and well implemented, because I think now it's all about that. It's the reform is done, the laws are there, the rules are there. So now the key thing to the future is how do we implement that reform we have in law, no? what I also see is that more jobs in Mexico will also translate into higher demand of U.S. goods and further reduce incentives to immigrate to the U.S. Because if we have those jobs in Mexico, people will not be willing to come here for looking for a job. No, so that also is a good news in economic sense. Also, I think the energy reform is going to bring as a spillover to Mexican households lower energy prices that are very much needed, because right now the bills in Mexico are very high in households and also for the industry. So it would make us more competitive in the business side, and in the household they will have lower bills for energy. Also, these lower bills will traduce in reduction of the electricity subsidies. That will leave more money for public finances, so we can build more schools, more hospitals, and reducing subsidies will traduce also in getting rid of one of our largest economic weaknesses, that is subsidies. We still subsidize much of the energy in Mexico. The biggest of all is the fuel subsidy. No, this year I saw, before coming here to the US, it's been 80 billion pesos spent in fuel subsidies. So that is going to be also good news for Mexico. I think another thing that is going to happen with the energy reform, it's good news for the border. The Eagle Ford shale basin extends over Texas and the Mexican states of Tamaulipas, Nuevo Laredo, and Coahuila. And also there's another basin that runs down to Veracruz that has plenty of gas and shale oil. And this region has a combined population of 38 million people. That is slightly bigger than Canada, actually. The GDP for that region in 2012 was $1.5 trillion. Under conservative assumptions, foreign direct investment in the area could add an extra 1% of GDP growth, which may expand at an average of 6% per year. No, so implying that that region could generate around 1.2 trillion in economic activity during the next decade. An amount similar. This is very important because it's an amount similar to the Spain economy. So it's very important what is going to happen in the border. Also, that is going to help to the border in the Mexican side to reduce the crime that is being happening there. No. And it's also a very good opportunity for the U.S. Towns in the border to grow, to be more similar to their Houston and Dallas and Austin cities that are near from them. No, I think this would also work in a benefit for Mexico in reducing the crime, as I said, but also the drug trafficking in the region. So I think those things happening with the energy reform are very important for Mexico. I would stop there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Antonio. Senior Representative Merrifield?
Sure. Well, thank you for coming. I thank you for the invite to be here. It's historic. I haven't been here for a month, actually, about a week. Interesting week. Very busy, and I'll breeze by Keystone a little bit, but there's no question that as we move forward, Alberta is looking at energy development. We're very much an energy-dependent or opportunity, depending how you look at it, province. But you have to do it with environmental responsible position, and I'll talk about what's happening in Alberta from that perspective. And we do have a fairly good story to tell, actually a very good story to tell, and I want to explain a little bit about that. But I'm a recovering politician, trying to be diplomat. I've just come out of being a member of Parliament, where my portfolio over the last number of years has been trade. So from a trade perspective, and this goes back to what Rochelle was saying, that when it comes to just looking at the world and demand for energy, it's significant, and the growing areas are in areas of the world where you're seeing populations moving from poverty to middle class at accelerated rates, and so we've refocused our trade agenda into those areas. Every trade agreement that we've been looking at in Canada signed, I think 43 of them in the last little while. I'm working on a number more. They want two fundamental things, which is energy and food independence. And energy independence is a big player in that. For sure that's what we should be talking about. We should be looking at that as we start looking at what both of our speakers were talking about, which is energy independent for North America. And that is a tremendous advantage when you look at a third of the world's GDP with energy independence. We're the only place in the world with that large GDP. So this becomes a great opportunity as you see the growing trade envelope expand some 70% over the next decade and a half. Those countries that capitalize on that will win. So our problem is infrastructure. That takes me to Keystone. Keystone is not about a pipeline. Unfortunately, it has been for about 2.5 years. It's been about politics. And we saw politics play out again yesterday a little bit. But it does tell us something about the broader scope of how to move infrastructure and what we have to do as countries and as industry. Pipelines are not just, and infrastructure is not oil development and gas development and others. It's not just about the dollars. You have that on one side and the economics of it. You also have on the other side those who are against it, all fossil fuel, which is a concern of climate change. Unfortunately, they're the louder voices on the extremes, both sides of it. Unfortunately, the facts in the middle become quite tamed down. And so the argument on Keystone, all of the facts point to if you build the pipeline, you will reduce GHGs. The State Department's own report says 28 to 42% more. Much safer. If you just replace it with Venezuelan oil, it's every barrel of that oil is higher GHGs than oil sands oil. So the arguments are pretty solid on if you build a pipeline, less GHGs, but it rings hollow because it's it's the extremes that are carrying the voice. So we have to start looking at resource development. Our premier we just got a new premier in Alberta. He's been campaigning and is very adamant that if we're doing resource development, we're in the business of environment at the same time. And I believe that this is where we have to go, and we have to get there very aggressively, and have to start talking a lot more about how we do that in a responsible way if we're going to move forward. In Alberta, as an example, we're the first jurisdiction in North America, actually, that has put a price on carbon. It's $15 a ton, and we have put that money. That's the interesting thing about it, because a lot of times, a tax on carbon in many jurisdictions, and I know nationally we were against it because it becomes wealth redistribution. And if it's to that, it's not going to work. If it's about putting it into a fund, as Alberta does, to be able to drive environmental excellence, then the industry wins. So they're not so opposed to putting it into that kind of a fund. And not only that, it accomplishes the goal, which is not wealth redistribution. The goal is reducing GHGs and being more environmentally conscious. And so that's a fund that's, I've got about $450 million, actually leveraged up to over $1 billion, around $1 billion, in some tremendous ingenuity that gives us the best technology in developing things such as everything from fertilizer, concrete, ski boots, fishing poles, and fleece jackets, as an example. So, there's a lot of things that these funds do to be able to create the very best in the world in technologies to in an environmentally acceptable way. And that's what the government is doing. But in Alberta, it goes further than that. And the most innovative thing that I've seen happen came from the industry itself in the last couple of years, which is the CASIA Group. which is a group of all of the CEOs from the oil sands of Alberta that got together and put on the table, actually. They basically said, you show me mine and I'll show you yours, or you show me yours, and on technology for environment. This is about $1 billion, not quite, about $900 million worth of technology that they put on the table so that they could raise the bar, take that technology and know, so that one knows what the other one is doing, what works, what doesn't work, and then together raise the bar on tailing ponds, on water, on land, and on air to be able to increase the environmental or reduce the environmental footprint of the oil sands. I sort of relate it to my own family. I grew up with lots of siblings, and we fought like cat and dog. And so the competitors in the oil sands are fiercely competitive. But when the neighbor kid came into the yard, we sort of ganged up on him. So it's the same sort of thing. When the oil sands is threatened, they have come up with this innovative thing, and some of the goals they're going to be announcing this winter as we go into spring are very significant. The reduction and the success is something that should not be underlooked, not only because of the success of it, but because if they can do it in the oil sands, we can do it in all energy.
Yeah.
We can do it anywhere. So this is, I would say, a bit of a paradigm shift in how we look at this. But Alberta's not talking enough about it. I don't think Albertans know about it. As a member of Parliament, I didn't know about it until this summer. So this is brand new, fresh off the press, and really quite creative. I wanted to share it here because I think it's important to talk about, and it's important to talk about it in the context of where we're going to go. Because when it comes to infrastructure and getting energy to coastline or to manufacturing, it's going to get there. When there's a market and there's a resource, it's going to get there. The private sector are very creative. And right now it's going to go by truck, train, or rail, or truck, train, or pipe. And right now we're seeing very, very much an expansion on rail. Its safety is of concern. We've had an incident in Canada that has killed 47. We had an incident in Lynchburg, Virginia, where it could have killed but didn't, thank goodness, and another one in North Dakota. You're actually right now at 700,000 barrels a day from the Bakken oil right now on rails. That's today. So this is something we shouldn't underestimate the risk of that to the population, and as a politician, you have to make decisions based on safety for sure. I think this is being overlooked a little bit in the context of what we're talking about. But there's no question that environment, and I'll give you another example of where I believe we're not speaking loud enough on the environmental front in Alberta, and actually our Premier Prentice has actually been the, let's say, the engineer of coal fire regulations in Canada, where we actually 2 years ago brought in coal fire regulations that would reduce greenhouse gases by not 30% by 2030, and that's what's being talked about down here, but by 46% by 2030. And by the way, the coal fire burners in the United States emit 25% more than the oil sands of Alberta, but 25 times more GHGs than the oil sands of Alberta. In fact, the oil sands of Alberta is not the biggest emitter in Alberta itself. It's the coal fire burners. So we are doing significant amount of work on GHG reduction, and we need to talk about it more, and we need to get serious about it. And I applaud the President, President Obama and China for finally getting together, the big emitters this weekend, at least talking about what they might do, even though we give it a jaundiced eye because of what they can actually implement. But when you talk about resource development, you cannot talk about that without an environmental conscience and environmental stewardship. So I'll leave it there.
Terrific, thank you. I just have a couple of questions I'll ask, and then we'll open it up to public questions in a few minutes. The first one, Rachel started discussing, and then Senior Representative Merrifield and also Antonio, on the idea of the social license. And we've seen this kind of play out in the Keystone issue, where actually the initial opposition was from local ranchers on the ground. They're worried about groundwater contamination, and it kind of morphed into conversation about greenhouse gases. Just wondering your thoughts on, what can governments do to try to acquire that social license, both from the GHG side and from kind of the local opposition sort of side?
Yeah, just maybe some kind of high-level thoughts. And actually, there's a story from Germany that I think is very, very relevant to this discussion. So if you bear with me on this. We were in Germany on a delegation. Germany has a very, very strong Green Party, as you well know. And the kind of push towards environmentalism is really seeped into the soul of Germany. And we were meeting at the time with a grid developer. And he was saying that even in Germany, he couldn't build any transmission lines. And so even there, where it should be so easy and so much, and they're willing to pay so much money to have a more environmentally friendly energy policy, they couldn't get through transmission processes. And so what his company has realized, this is where it comes back here, because we were hearing this of Canadian companies who realized it, US companies are beginning to as well, is that so much has to be done upfront by the companies themselves before they start moving into development plans. And we're seeing company by company begin to realize that those early conversations can actually save them a lot of problems when they're siting their transmission lines, whether it's wires or pipes or whatever they're talking about. So it's really there's a responsibility of the companies, and up until recently, it had been kind of left to the to whether it's the federal government, if it was international, or states, to kind of figure it out, and then the companies would come in behind. That doesn't work anymore. At our conference too, we had the minister, the premier of Quebec, the minister of energy for Quebec. And he was saying as well that, kind of following on that logic, that the more local you can get, the better, that they were having more success at a state to province level than they were, not surprisingly, waiting for international agreements. So the more local you can get this conversation, both because you understand the problems as well, but the advance work that needs to be done, the more likely you are to get the social license to move forward. And I think that's where we're beginning to see more progress and kind of less heat around the issue, although it's still very challenging, and maybe it's something Mexico can learn from as well, and I'm sure it's already learned from.
No, I would say that you're absolutely right. States and provinces have a tremendous role when it comes to social license, and that I think can't be overemphasized. We're seeing what happens in gridlock at the federal levels. Those are very hot political arenas, and perhaps some a little more sane chatting. And I come from one of those arenas, so I've lived it for a number of years. But at the state level, I think we might be able to have a less tempered, more moderate discussion on it by those who may have an ideological position either way, but you can get together the moderate voices to be able to come together to build a greater consensus in the middle that will accomplish these infrastructure projects to move forward. In Canada, you hear a lot about the Keystone Pipeline, but there's another pipeline south, there's two east, and there are two west. Our problem is getting infrastructure to Tidewater to capitalize on those growing markets on energy. And the growing markets in energy are not the United States. It's not Mexico either. It's those growing markets internationally. And we really should just link arms collectively in North America and go after those markets together. The productivity that we gain because of energy independence is significant, and I think we undersell that, and we're not looking broad enough or big enough in explaining that to the populations of our countries when it comes to these infrastructure builds.
As Rachel and Rob said, I think oil and gas is going to be present in our life for many, many years, for our children and the children, maybe the children of our children. So I think one of the key issues of not only for Mexico, but for all the region, North American region, is appropriate communication to the public. No, we have to be able to communicate adequately, that we have the that right technology exists, so environmental issues can be met, no, can be addressed. Yeah, thank you very much. So I think that's going to be a very important issue. And in Mexico, we have much to learn because you have already many things done here in the U.S. Keystone could be a very interesting thing to study. No, so I think right now in Mexico we're a virgin territory in that sense. No, and the federal government and the local governments have a homework to do in order to communicate to the people what is going to be happening in the energy industry. As you know, Mexico's industry was a close one. So Mexico, we don't care about too much these issues. But I think that in the years to come, it will be getting more and more attention from the public, no? And in that sense, good communication is very important to let people know that things are going to be done with the right technology and enforcement of laws, so the environment is appropriately cared. No.
It's very good. One of the questions, there's a North American Energy Ministerial coming up, I believe, next month. And one of the things, and Antonio kind of touched on this, and I was wondering if we could kind of pull that out and extrapolate on that a bit. One of the things that was also mentioned is people power, especially in Mexico, is empowering people. But I know there's issues actually in all three countries in terms of matching skills for these new energy jobs with people that are being educated. Is that something that we could perhaps see discussed at this ministerial? Any other issues? Perhaps investment coordination. I know that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about later. But any ideas on maybe a good way to trilaterally address some of those problems?
Well, in our province, our number one issue is, infrastructure to Tidewater, as we talked about. But the real acute problem that we have right now is lack of labor, and the lack of high-quality labor. So I think you're absolutely on the right track. These energy projects give opportunity for tremendous numbers of jobs. They're high-paying jobs. They rebuild communities in a phenomenal way. My hometown is right in the middle of the Duvernay gas field, which is one of the largest in the world and richest in the world. It's just about to be developed. I can't say enough how I live day to day with number one problem being lack of people, too many jobs. Now that sounds almost braggish. That is a problem. Most people would die for that problem. But it is an acute problem, and it needs to be addressed. And it is handicapping Alberta at the present time because we don't have those skills and just the boots on the ground to be able to accommodate the kind of growth that we need.
I think one of the most important issues that has to be addressed by the three governments is the balance of the oil and gas production, so prices would not be affected by the production in each country. I think that we could win as a region if we can take action in that agreement. But if not, it's going to be against ourselves. So I think that's going to be a really big, important issue.
I think, Andrew, what you're pointing out is that the resources are there. There's just so many challenges in getting them out. I think we're bullish about getting them out, but these are real in terms of both infrastructure and human capital. I was up at Fort McMurray, up at the oil sands in Canada, and exactly this issue where they were saying that there's a labor shortage. And so I asked where you're getting the labor from, and they're like, well, we're recruiting in the United States, which was a little eye-popping because we don't have all the labor that we need in the United States. So there's a shortage of labor. So we all need to quit our jobs and become petroleum engineers because there's a lot of good work coming for us and our children. So that's something that you're highlighting, which is that the challenge isn't necessarily resources, but it's getting it all to market. Before this session ends, I did just want to make sure that we got price on the table, because that's, go ahead, I'll flip it over to you.
Oh, so and that was actually my next question was.
Sorry. I'll let you be the moderator.
Sorry. Well, no, it's good. It kind of flows from this. That's one of the questions. You know, the resource is there, as we've all said, but there are certain challenges, whether price or infrastructure, or, human capital. But what do you see as, if this $80 a barrel becomes the norm? Obviously, that's the world price, and there's different prices set throughout the region. But what effect do you see that on some of these infrastructure builds?
And I think something that was really interesting was that Minister Al Naimi from Saudi Arabia was in Mexico, and that's a reminder. He doesn't show up until there's an issue on prices, and he wants to figure out what's going on in OPEC, what's going on with Venezuela, and then what's going on in non-OPEC states like Mexico. So it's pretty interesting that he showed up. It was long planned, so they said, but he has a habit of not showing up when he doesn't need to. So I think it was very important that they're focused on price, and we've been watching all this kind of global, the setting of global energy prices. What I think is very interesting for the conversations and what price raises for Mexico to some extent, which is with this glut of energy coming onto the market, how is Mexico thinking about now coming forth with increasing its supply? Up until very recently, the story was demand-driven, right? Demand was just going to outpace supply, and so you couldn't produce enough. And now we're clearly seeing that, at least in the short-term moment, that there is a glut out there. And so how does a country that's about to put more on, all three of us are in that position, think about? For Mexico, what's interesting is your traditional energy sources are at like 40, you're competitive at $40 to $45 a barrel. Deep water is different, but that's good news for you. My understanding on the oil sands is that you're fine, except if you're going in situ, if you're going into the more carbon-friendly kinds of minings, that your price becomes higher. And so I'd be interested to know kind of how Canada's thinking about that. Our shale is okay at 80. There's some outliers that aren't, that are actually getting hit, but the core of our industry will hold at that. And so I think that we're okay around 80. So the good news, I think, for where we sit now is all three countries actually can get energy out. If it drops much lower, it's a different conversation. I do want to say, though, and it's something I've been thinking of, and I'd welcome your thoughts on this, is there's enormous excitement from consumers in particular, and for thinking about kind of economic development, about the excitement of $80 a barrel, certainly compared to 100 or 140. But if you look at the history of energy prices, $80 per barrel is still at historically high levels. Historically high levels. The last few years have been this incredible blip. So the transformation of our kind of global energy will continue if we hold at 8. And I think it just suggests we should be a little bit mindful when we're reading these kind of exuberant stories of $80. That if you go back 10 years ago and you start talking about $80, there were questions then about what our economy could withstand. So energy is still extremely expensive, and especially if we think about the kind of the developing area and kind of what they're drawing on. And so that balance between this crazy world we're living in, which so much is coming on and prices are coming down, and what that means for all the industries, but it's still at historically high levels, and it's still really hurting consumers globally. So I think that's kind of important to put on the mix. But
yeah, and Alberta is watching the prices very closely, no question. But it wasn't that many years ago, as you said. I remember well when someone who was an owner of part of the oil sands, and the price at that time had moved from $25 up to $55. He said, well, it's not going to stay at 55 very long. Instead of dropping back to 30 or 25, it shot up, and we've seen this move up and down. Anyone who's been in the industry for a long period of time knows that it's up and down. And in Alberta, it's quite a mature industry. So, will they make decisions, on expansion based on price? Certainly. Are we going to see, shut-ins and industry stop because of the price? I doubt. Are we watching it? Are we concerned about it? Absolutely. But are we panicking? I don't think that's where we're at or where we should be. There's always some upsides to it. We are cushioned a little bit because of the dollar. in Alberta as well. So, the impact is there, but not as acute as it could be. I think, a bigger concern for the industry is being able to capitalize on the growing markets of the world. By the way, Keystone is not that. It's not destined for outside. It's the other pipelines that are.
My thoughts about oil prices are that it isn't an extraordinary business anymore, but it's a great business anyway. So for Mexico, it's still business, as Rachel said. And we are looking to produce 1 million barrels, extra million barrels in Mexico. But we think there's still space in the intern demand of Mexico's and its growing demand that we could place those barrels there and maybe export some of them, but mainly for our own consumption.
Okay, perfect. Look at the time. We probably only have time for one question. So I just asked if you could identify yourself, state your organization, and keep your question concise and a question. Just go first right here, gentlemen. Tan jacket.
Can I have two questions?
Sure. If you,
Okay.
if they're concise.
Yes, Sergey Kostev, Financial University, Moscow, Russia. My first question is to representative of Alberta, Canada. If I'm not mistaken, TransCanada has some lobbying, PR, and law firms helping to get U.S. government approval of the Keystone. So does Alberta government have some lobbying, PR, and law firm helping to get U.S. government approval? And my second question is to representative from Mexico. If I'm not mistaken, there is a war on drugs in Mexico, all this violence around it. So does it affect Mexico ability to attract foreign investments? Thanks.
If I got the question right, it's do we have a law firm, sort of on helping it to get it through? Well, actually, I've spent a fair amount of my time over the last while. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a politician because, as I said, this wasn't about legality. This is about politics, and I believe I've had one-on-one discussions with over 100 members of Congress in the last year, and there's no question that we're stating the case aggressively on all of the merits of the pipeline from a political perspective, and they're powerful, they're compelling. When it comes to the legality, I mean, there is a court case in Nebraska, but that's up to U.S. courts. TransCanada is fighting that in courts and having to comply with what the courts are going to say. We're waiting for that decision sometime. Courts will do what courts do, but it's expected sometime before Christmas, but that's not for sure. At any rate, as a government, we are not into the, hiring law firms other than maybe in-house, but not, for advice. But I'm not aware of any that I know of. But I do know that as a government, we're absolutely seized and ask only one thing from the United States, and that's to look at this case on its science and by the merits, and have it approved.
Tanya, internal security. Yeah.
Thank you. About drug trafficking and crime in Mexico, yeah. It's mainly affecting the northern states in Mexico where the gas basins are. I think it is an issue, but it can be controlled. I think Mexico's government is trying to do its job by controlling the crime there. The companies, the industry that is going to be implementing their industries, they have to address the security issue by taking some risk controls so they can operate with no problem. But I don't see in any way affecting international investment in Mexico for oil and gas. I think the companies are very interested. I think they want to invest in Mexico, and I think that they already know that there's an issue, a security issue there for them by operating in Mexico. but it can be managed, so they can work there without problems in Mexico. Yeah.
Terrific. All right. If you could help me, give the panel a round of applause. If you just want to hold tight, we'll start on our oil and gas futures in just one moment. Thank you.
Rob, nice meeting you.
It was nice meeting you. Thank you.
Let me give you my card.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Thanks, Antonio.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. Let me give you my card so you can.
Mine with me also, so,
Don't worry.
yeah.
Local, so I forgot my
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Andrew, thank you very much for